Hello everyone, and welcome to the SETWind session at the EERA annual event that is co-organized with the ETIPWind and the SETWind project. My name is Mattias Andersson, and I'm the coordinator of the SETWind project. And I'm very happy to welcome you here on the session on creating multinational projects and lighthouse initiatives. We have an excellent range of speakers, and I really look forward to introduce them to you. But let me just briefly start by telling you what the SETWind project is. So the SETWind project is supporting the SETPlan implementation plan for offshore wind. And the implementation plan was first published in 2018, and it has an implementation working group consisting of member states, industry, the Commission, and R&D community that is supporting it. An important part of the implementation working group is to implement the implementation plan. And at the moment, we're in the process of updating the initial plan that was published in 2018. The reason why we want to update it is that a lot of things has been happening in offshore wind for the last 5 years. Indeed, when we published the implementation plan in 2018, some of the cost targets we had set was almost already surpassed, so we knew we had to update that. And in addition to that, we wanted to address some other issues. First of all, we wanted also to address the potential for larger, what we call lighthouse initiatives, so ambitious R&D projects at a lower TRL that supports the implementation plan. We also want to look at different kind of impact assessment for R&D projects. And we wanted to address the social science and humanities dimension of offshore wind, because as we build out offshore wind, the issues of opportunities and challenges for citizens become more and more dominant. So without ado, and with this very short introduction to the SETWind project, I'd like to just start by thanking all of you, the audience, for being here, and also thanking, of course, our speakers, who we have in the virtual backstage and who will come online in a moment. So we have Joachim Balke from the European Commission, the General Directorate for Energy, and the dossier holder for the offshore energy strategy that's due to be published in late October. Very much look forward to the presentation by Joachim. Then we have Chris Foulds, who is from the Anglia Ruskin University in the UK, but importantly in this context, he's one of the coordinators of the Energy Shift projects that is supporting, that's kind of the technology platform for social science and humanities in the SETPlan context. Following him, we'll have the John Olav Tande, who's my colleague in the SETWind project and our Lighthouse Initiative ambassador. And finally, we have Michael Hübner from the Federal Ministry in Austria, who will talk about the Clean Energy Transition Partnership. So without further ado, I will give the word to Joachim from the European Commission. Thank you. Hello, Joachim.
Hello. Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you very much, Mattias, for giving me the floor and for inviting me for today's session. So indeed, I think, first of all, it's clear that offshore renewable energy can play a very instrumental role in both achieving our strategic objective to become climate neutral by mid-century, but also, and I think this is another important dimension for our strategy, in our efforts to relaunch our economy in this specific, let's say, difficult moment where we're still trying to overcome the basically economic downturn as a consequence of COVID. So while we have a renewable target for 32% for 2030, as you will also be aware, it is this week that the Commission is looking into an upgrade of our targets for the midterm, so for 2030, in order to get us on track for climate neutrality. And that will certainly also have consequences then on the needed contribution of offshore renewable energies to that overall objective, let's say. What I would also like to point at is that earlier this year, in June, the Commission has already published two strategies. The strategy, or in July rather, on system integration and accompanying that another one on hydrogen. And these already form a coherent set of initiatives which look at how to integrate basically more renewable energy into the energy system in an efficient manner. And it is very much in that context of a more integrated energy system that we are now looking also into an enhanced contribution of offshore renewables to that overall effort. Clearly for 2050, if we want to reach climate neutrality, we will have to scale up drastically offshore renewables. In our long-term strategy, we have given an indication of multiplying our current capacity by something in between 10 and 20, which shows you quite clearly that there is really a step change which is needed in the use of offshore renewables. What is important in that context for us as Commission is that we look at the full range of available technologies. So certainly offshore wind, and in particular fixed bottom offshore wind, is the front runner and is the technology that is already mainstream today, I would say. But there's a whole range of other offshore renewable technologies, starting from floating wind, but also wave, tidal, and others, which are at varying stages of the technological development. And which we also want to likewise target with our strategy in order to really have a full portfolio of technologies that can contribute and complement each other. That broad scope, I would say, is very important for us as we prepare the strategy. In order to use that potential of all the technologies fully, there are a number of specific obstacles that we think we would need to address, and I think let's say the theme which runs through all of this is that more regional cooperation is needed. Also partially EU-wide cooperation, but in particular regional cooperation, sea basin level cooperation, we think is going to be a key tool for tapping this offshore potential. So it's in that context that we develop our strategy, and let me perhaps briefly enumerate 4 key obstacles or challenges, let's say, that we see and that we think we would like to address. First, it's clear that integrating the additional amount of clean electricity generation that we need into our energy system cannot be based exclusively on the way that we have developed infrastructure so far. We think that a more holistic infrastructure development is needed, which also looks again in a regional cooperation perspective at the infrastructure needs, which derive from the renewable deployment in the offshore basins that is foreseen. So I think that is definitely one of the key issues that we want to address. Again, this concerns first of all the question of building out the electricity networks needed both offshore but also with a link to the onshore grids to integrate those renewables. But it's also it should also look at the possibilities deriving from system integration. So in particular, the question, can offshore renewables also then be used for hydrogen production, for example? I think these questions of system integration we would like to look into in a more, let's say, coherent manner, in a more regional manner. That would also include then indeed the realization of multinational projects, such as those that you're looking into from a more technical perspective. And we do want to look at the conditions, let's say, from a regulatory angle also, that would allow such multinational projects to come forward as one of the building blocks of a future offshore system. One of the building blocks, I should underline. So if this is the first identified challenge, the second one is clearly what are the investment conditions that need to be in place? Are there barriers that need to be removed to attract the necessary finance? Again, this is particularly relevant under the conditions of developing a more integrated and cost-efficient offshore electricity system. Such a system will ultimately be beneficial from a societal perspective, but it might take another look at what is needed to make building such an integrated and cross-national system also attractive from the perspective of individual economic actors which need to invest. So second, this is the second point, investment conditions. Thirdly, a sea-basin approach needs to be considered in our view, and that refers also very importantly to the questions on how to use the sea space in a coordinated manner. So maritime spatial planning, I think, is the term here that, as you're all aware, is key. Again, we think this is a challenge that needs to be looked at more than it has been looked at in the past in a regional context. Fourthly, a strategic approach is also needed to maintain our European global leadership in the industrial and technological development of offshore renewables. Clearly, we have in many technologies, we have a leading position in globally, which has very positive impacts on employment also in Europe. But again, under the current circumstances, more than ever, we have an interest to maintain that global leading position. I think we have to take into account that there is going to be more competition also on a global level. There's going to be higher targets and objectives also in other regions beyond Europe, which could be an enormous chance for our industry if they manage to export basically our knowledge and get a foothold also in those emerging markets, in particular in Asia and North America, where we expect offshore renewable developments to take off soon, actually. So this industrial dimension is another important challenge that we want to look at. Okay, let me just give you a few more highlights, perhaps from what we think the offshore strategy should do. On energy aspects in particular, the strategy should address the issue of coordinating long-term planning and development of offshore and onshore electricity grids. I think it's widely acknowledged that this is a key factor. And as you will be also aware, we're looking also into a review of the 10E regulation that we are committed still to bring forward in the form of a legislative proposal by the end of the year. And that is another work strand which will then pick up on the question of how to develop and plan offshore grids in this more integrated manner. Moreover, creating a favorable and predictable framework for investors and operators in renewable energy for the unprecedented upscaling of renewables is certainly key. And we will look at all the regulatory instruments which are relevant here. I want to say just a few more words on the question of regional cooperation at sea basin level. As I said, this is relevant or can become relevant in our view in all major sea basins that are part of our European space. Clearly, sort of the development is already more advanced in some than others. So the North Sea region, is certainly the front runner. The NSEC group has been looking into all the issues I mentioned already for almost a decade. And there is, of course, already a significant rollout of offshore bottom fixed wind developments in the North Sea region. It's very important to mention also the BMIP, so the Baltic Sea region in this context, where there is a high political interest in pushing cooperation on offshore renewables and related infrastructure developments that will be shown and demonstrated, I believe, at the end of this month in a conference which is planned in Szczecin, Poland, where there's going to be a declaration of political intent to basically, I would say, follow a bit in the steps of the North Sea and develop this regional cooperation. But we do believe this can be also relevant for other sea basins. That is why we have been conducting a study in DG Energy, but with the help of consultants and with member states, on the potential for such cooperation in the Mediterranean Sea basin, which again has a number of sub-regions, to map out this potential. And here we have several groups, regional groups, which could be relevant for such cooperation. For example, CESEC, where coming from a slightly different agenda, the countries in that regional group have also started to look into regional cooperation for offshore renewables. And lastly, we have the high-level group for Southwest Europe, which would look into the same aspects also as regards the Atlantic Basin. So regional cooperation, it is true at the moment at different stages, but as a blueprint basically which can be relevant for many regions. Just to finish off by saying that if these are the more directly energy policy related elements, there are some other elements, there are the policy areas which are relevant for the strategy. First of all, I would like to mention environmental policy and the impacts on biodiversity, which of course have to be fully taken into account, as well as circular economy dimensions. Maritime planning, as I said, is important. And then, of course, not to forget here in this context, research and innovation to strengthen current EU leadership in offshore technologies. It needs to be pushed further, both on grid-related aspects as well as, in particular, on generation technologies such as ocean energy, renewables, which are not yet as mature and advanced, perhaps, as fixed bottom wind. I think that's what I would say by way of introduction to the strategy and the scope it is intended to cover. Again, given the scale of the task and the urgency of the situation, in view of the really very, very ambitious climate targets that we have, I think it's very important that all stakeholders come together to discuss this issue. It's very good that you have organized this video conference today, and I'm looking forward to hearing your views and following your discussions later. Thank you very much again for the invitation.
Thank you very much, Joachim, and thanks for a brilliant presentation here. If this had been a room, I'm sure it had a proper applause, but thanks a lot for joining. I have to say, from an R&D perspective, this is not the presentation we could dream of, because it certainly doesn't sound like we'll be short of challenges, and it also seems like some of these will indeed require an R&D perspective. Just for all the viewers, you can add your questions in the discussion panel. We've had a few questions, or one question already. It has also been answered by Peter Eason, the chair of EERA JP-Wind. So I think that's a valid question, or a valid answer for that one. But Joachim, maybe on a few of the things you mentioned. So just to kind of recap. So you mentioned the need for a more holistic approach. You mentioned the challenges related to grid infrastructure. You highlighted very much the need for regional cooperation, basically at all levels, whether that's in terms of sea basins or R&D or regulatory issues. You mentioned the investment condition, which is of course a big issue if we're going to scale up. The multi-use of sea or the spatial planning of sea is going to be a challenge. It's not only wind turbines that are out there. We also have fishermen, we have military, we have shipping industry, etc. And then you of course mentioned the global leadership in the technology that we actually maintain that. Coming back to the investment conditions, could you maybe dig a bit more into that? What do you see as kind of the highlight issues there on that, in order, because we need that rapid scale up also of the investment in order to make this work.
Yeah, clearly, it's clearly key that investment conditions are right. But also here, I would perhaps differentiate a little bit, and that I think is the other theme running through our whole strategy and to what I wanted to convey today. That let's say the challenges are really quite different according to the technologies that we're speaking of. And again, we're talking also about both the generation side and the grid side. So I think for all of this, we have challenges. Some of them are the same, some of them are not. I would say perhaps there are perhaps two sort of overriding issues. One is I think we have to get the balance right between, and here I think I speak in particular for the, let's say, the competitive parts of the market, so the generation. On the one hand, having an investment framework that is, let's say, significantly stable and predictable for the investors in offshore wind parks, for example, to allow them to basically to master the enormous financial, the enormous finance which is needed. On the other hand, we of course also have to ensure that the let's say we maintain a market framework which maintains both a sort of a level playing field between the different actors, and which allocates, I would say, risks in an appropriate manner. So to those who can bear them, and let's say to the amount that we can bear them. This is not necessarily an easy balancing act, but I think this is what we need to get right, because ultimately we're talking about finance that has to be mainly, of course, private finance, but which will to a certain extent probably also be underpinned by some kind of, let's say, mechanisms to stabilize the revenue and perhaps even to support the investments. So in other words, it's going to have an impact on the customer, and it is in that perspective that, of course, let's say the efficiency criteria has to be there as well. So that's the one thing. The other thing that I want to mention, I think one of the key difficulties that we need to address is how to distribute costs and benefits in an appropriate manner. And that is in particular tricky for this kind of multinational projects that I think you've been looking at as well, especially then if they are to be rolled out on a commercial level. And that again concerns both the grid side as well as the generation side. So I think that is also something, for example, that in the context of NSEC, we as a Commission have been called upon to look into what is the right mechanism to find an appropriate balance of costs and benefits for all parties concerned. Because I think only if we have this robust mechanism in place will member states actually be willing to underwrite, I would say, such multinational projects.
Excellent. Thanks a lot, Joachim. We have a question from the audience before I get back to making a nice link to Chris Schultz's presentation. So there's a question here whether including the Mediterranean Sea in the offshore program, will this mean specific calls and/or dedicated funding? And I guess we're referring to Horizon Europe here. So is that something you'd like to speak out about, Joachim?
Well, I don't want to overstep my competences too much, so I think promising specific calls probably goes a little bit beyond what I should do today. I mean, it is clear that there's a whole range of financing instruments on the table, both at the research side with Horizon that you mentioned, but I think also then if we look at basically the recovery fund, there's many instruments and the volumes are high, and then of course we have our Connecting Europe facility, which allows financing in cross-border projects on the grid side and now also on the renewable side. I would just say that in principle these instruments are available for all member states and for all sea basins, and some of them are allocated sort of on a member state basis. where then it is for us to work with member states to encourage them basically to use funds in that manner. Some of them are centrally managed, and then you will have a competition basically for those funds, with the most convincing proposals winning the day. But yeah, I mean, the key thing is that many instruments are available, and to underline that they are in principle available for all geographical regions that we mentioned.
Very good, thanks. Now, since we have the next speaker coming on in the moment talking about the societal dimension of offshore wind, I'd like to cue you a bit in on that. I mean, we have to talk about the just transition in the Green Deal, and you mentioned it here also, the fair split between who gets what. What are the thoughts? Do we have anything in the upcoming strategy on this topic? I mean, this is going to influence. If we see large build out of offshore wind in the Mediterranean, Baltics, that will create new jobs, new infrastructures. It'll influence people's life. How do you see that in this context?
Absolutely. Public acceptance is key, that's for sure. It is key for infrastructure build out. It is key for renewable energy build out. That's perhaps more obvious when we speak of sort of onshore developments, but it's very relevant also for offshore developments, where notably, I mean, this question of how to balance the inevitably growing use of the seabed for energy purposes with other legitimate concerns, including biodiversity protection. And I think that is getting that balance right, again, I think is one key to ensuring public acceptance is there. The other thing, since you mentioned in particular the regions in transition, it is indeed important for us that we are on the industrial dimension. We're talking about a whole supply chain which can benefit not only the immediate coastal regions, but also to a certain extent, I mean, for example, if we look at turbine manufacturing, it can benefit all member states, and it can benefit many regions. And it is indeed one interesting element, and that's an exercise that we're doing to see, is there perhaps a specific interest also for some regions which otherwise might indeed lose out through the energy transition, to compensate directly or indirectly from what we think can be extra growth and employment driven by offshore.
Excellent. Joachim, thank you very much. I think we are reaching the end of the scheduled program time. I really want to thank you for your presentation here. We do have quite a few claps in our live stream here, so I assume that's a compliment. And with that, we're trying to make a nice bridge here to the next speaker, who is Chris Foulds. So Chris is a researcher at the Anglia Ruskin University, and he's the coordinator of the Energy Shifts project, which is the, you can call it the European Technology and Innovation Platform for Social Science and Humanities. So we're very happy to have Chris on board here, and in the SETWind project, we'll also be working with him in the in the update of the implementation plan. So Chris, over to you.
Thank you very much, and thanks indeed for the kind invitation. So today I'll be talking about the societal dimension of offshore wind, and as has already been mentioned, I'm involved in the coordination of the Energy Shifts project, and in a couple of slides time I'll mention a little bit more about that. But really, I suppose I have one main aim or hope out of this. It's to hope that by the end of me talking through this presentation, you'll go away convinced, hopefully, that the social sciences and humanities, essentially all of the research that is on people and societies, can positively contribute, and perhaps even centrally, to the research innovation of offshore wind. So primarily a technological topic of offshore wind, but even with that, the social science and humanities, we think, still can offer an awful lot. And I've got this picture here of the SET plan because it's something that, as a project, we have sort of a keen interest in doing these sorts of, giving these sorts of contributions to all of the SET plan areas. And I'll say a few words in a moment about some of the things we're doing on that. So really, I suppose I'm going to go through three things. Firstly, I'm going to really quickly say, and I'm going to try and zoom through it, what I see Energie SSH as being. And the reason why I do this is because I think it's important to step back and just think about all of the stuff that's there, all of the things that it could offer. As often it's used in only certain ways, I would say, and then give plenty of examples about all these different ways and issues that I think it could help further European offshore wind on. And then I've aimed to give 5 recommendations for the future. And I've tried to sort of be intentionally a bit provocative to get you thinking. And, and I really welcome critique and debate around these. And obviously they very much come from me as a social scientist, sort of offering my view on these things. So yes, be interested to hear what you'd think on it. So, as has been mentioned, energy shifts. Indeed, it's part of the ETIPs, really. It's sort of viewed as the SSH equivalent, the cross-cutting SSH equivalent of all the ETIPs. So it's meant to straddle all of the different technological silos, because of course, people are in all of these different professions and sectors. And I think this also complements the Commission's priority for Horizon 2020 and Horizon Europe more generally, that SSH is a mainstreaming priority. So with all of the technical projects that they're wanting to fund, they see SSH as being something that should be embedded within all of these things. And this is the sort of space that we're operating within. So it's a 2-year project, although actually it looks like it will be extended a bit to the end of July next year. And we're really keen to engage with all policy actors at a European level, and with the SET plan in particular, to show how SSH can contribute to the SET plan objectives. So one such example, at the moment, we're working with experts from 25 plus countries across Europe, all asking them all around what they see as the big questions for research and innovation from an SSH perspective, for instance, for renewables. So offshore wind is obviously fitting neatly within that. We've got a working group dedicated to thinking, well, as we prepare for Horizon Europe, what do we think the Commission, the community, should be focusing their efforts on if we really want to, get SSH to contribute to the European energy policy objectives. But intentionally in this presentation, I don't really talk too much around project specifics, but happy to take any questions or for you to email me afterwards if there's any thoughts on project specifics and activities we're doing. So what do I see as SSH being? I think my main thing that I want to emphasize is that there's 2 different sides here. There's the social sciences and there's the humanities. And the main reason I want to emphasize this is because of the EC's interest, which I think is excellent in the fair and just transition. I think actually it is a real unfulfilled potential of the humanities. It's sort of research and ideas that haven't really been pulled on very much, and that we've tended to go to the social sciences more. I'll quickly explain why from my view. So these are the sorts of things. I mean, don't worry too much about the definition on the screen, but essentially social scientists are interested in, why do people do what they do? How does that change when there's energy system changes? And therefore, what could we try to do if we want to change their behavior or pull them in more desirable directions? So if we want to move to a low carbon energy transition, if we want more offshore wind, then why and how do humans act in the way they do that we can try and make that happen? Whereas I think the humanities, they're perhaps a bit more philosophical, and they'll ask these sorts of questions about, inequality, equity, fairness, justice, cruelty, faith, morality, all of these sorts of issues. So in a way that it's putting the spotlight on the taken for granted priorities of society. And I think this is really important to emphasize from my side, because the humanities will start to question, where do we want to go to Europe? So what is offshore wind, for instance, in delivering a just transition where no one is left behind, in the EU's words? What does that actually mean in terms of these sorts of issues? I think this is where SSH, or the humanities, can offer answers, and then the social sciences can essentially offer leverage points where we could try and make that change happen. So this is social sciences around how can we change people's behaviors, what can be done, whereas the humanities is sort of a bit more reflective about where do we want to take them to, why are we wanting to do this. So that's a bit of the background. So moving on to some more examples. So I think, you know, this is immediately showing that all of these sorts of issues I had on the screen there are relevant for offshore wind and for energy transition. So, for instance, how do design expectations meet real everyday experiences, and what can be done based on those experiences, sort of the lived reality of new tech? How can that be learned from to optimize technology? And this isn't just from sort of the householder or the citizen. This is from professionals, because of course, you know, industry are users of technology just as much as those users who, you know, perhaps we're talking more from a citizen engagement perspective. And then thinking from the citizens and the communities, you know, thinking about what would they want from a new offshore wind. And there's a lot in SSH research that talks about something called place attachments. So how do you as an individual identify and attach yourself to a particular place and space? You know, a lovely view, or that has an economic meaning because you just go to a place for a job, but you attach yourself to places in different ways. So if you suddenly dump a huge offshore wind development somewhere, what does that mean for place attachments and people's acceptance, as was already mentioned in the previous presentation? Of course, there's going to be some big changes to industry and, you know, employment. Be tens of thousands of people employed in offshore wind. So how best to skill a new workforce? How can they be trained? Where do they come from? These regional geographical considerations are really important. And what happens to local communities when sort of mass onshore wind arrives somewhere where it didn't really exist before? What happens, and how do they feel about this? These things, I think, you know, just go to emphasize how SSH is so important. So now I've got a couple, just 2 slides on a couple of projects that have been funded through Horizon 2020 that sort of emphasize a few more of these examples around why SSH is useful in some of these states. So this was a €2 million project that I was involved in coordinating, sort of like the predecessor of energy shifts in some way. And part of what we did was we reviewed a lot of the existing research out there to show how it was already useful for policymakers or for you know, innovators or industries. Essentially, we don't need to fund new ideas. There's a certain amount of good ideas that are already there that we can pull on. So we did some annotated bibliographies where we sort of accessibly walked people through some research in this area, particularly around, you know, energy supplies and renewables, really. And we talk about how there's a whole field, you know, decades of work around what's called transition studies, which is really just dedicated to studying innovations and how something that's niche and small scale can be scaled up and normalized and become mainstream across society. So there's loads there that can be drawn upon. And in this document, we also talk about the importance of energy justice, which I keep flagging and I come on to in a bit more detail in a few slides' time. And then the other example is a nice project called Entrust, which is sort of a bit more thinking about renewables in the context of an energy system and thinking about how can stakeholders be involved. So this is, as it's put here, you know, integrating the public as active and legitimate stakeholders. So ideas of energy citizenship, which again sort of is mentioned in various commission-led strategies. Obviously, there's a lot around mission-orientated approaches, again linking into Horizon Europe. And I think it fits all of these sorts of ideas around sort of broadening the boundaries of those that set the agenda. And it includes, you know, some of these disciplines that are often looked over. Okay, so some tangible and perhaps provocative, but you tell me, recommendations. Number 1, I suggest that we move beyond social impacts. Of course, they're important, but I think SSH can do a lot more than just being brought in at the end. I think quite a lot of the time, consideration of people, the SSH component, is brought in at the end. So perhaps a decision or a strategy will be set, and then SSH will be brought in to say, well, okay, what's the impact on society? But I think SSH can tell us a lot more about the influences and experiences across, say, the full life cycle. I mean, it was mentioned in the previous the previous Q&A about supply chain considerations, and I think that's right. You know, there's the supply chain considerations, there's the life cycle of, you know, development, so from its planning to installation to maintenance to end of life disposal. There's all sorts of moments where people are involved, and I think this is just thinking about trying to think about social dimensions from day one. I mean, we've done some work with the Energy National Contact Point Network of Europe to try and get them to think a bit more around how SSH can be sort of how applicants for framework program projects can be supported in SSH. And something that we emphasize is that bringing SSH into the concept, so from day one, as opposed to just thinking about it in terms of dissemination or communication or impacts, is really important, and I think really benefits the project. It just gives it more of a holistic feel, even if it's, you know, fair enough, a technology project. And moving beyond social acceptance, so this isn't to say that social acceptance isn't important, but the way that social acceptance is often used, it tends to involve citizens in a bit more of a passive way. So, for instance, a top-down decision is made, and then the idea of social acceptance is on persuasion, so persuading them that the impact is good. Whereas, what if we changed it and became, you know, flipped it round and thought radically, and perhaps it doesn't always sit comfortably, but being more participatory, or getting them actively involved in some of the decision making from the start. So, you know, what do you want? Where would you want your offshore wind to be placed? It was mentioned earlier around, you know, how to use sea space in a coordinated manner, bringing citizens or broadening the boundaries of who could, you know, feed into that decision, if they even care about who makes that decision. And I think all of this fits the EU's hopes for sort of fairer, more inclusive futures, and of course, you know, it's focus on democratic principles. And just to sort of give a recent example of how this, I think, has been used quite well. In the last week, the findings of the UK Climate Assembly has been published, and I think maybe around 120 people were strategically chosen from all different backgrounds across the UK. Had loads of conversations with experts, digested all the evidence, and then we're asked, right, what should you do as a citizen? Well, how would you decide as an assembly to make the UK net zero? And interestingly, based upon this evidence, offshore wind was viewed incredibly favourably. It was the only electricity generation technology where there was zero disagreement. You'll see that 80% had strong agreement, 15% agreement, and 5% mind, compared to some of these others here. So you can immediately see that going through this process sort of gave the sign off that, you know, offshore wind is great. It added credibility and perhaps more weight to bigger policy investment decisions, and I think, you know, was hopefully a real learning experience for all those involved in the assembly itself. Focusing on energy justice for all. So, I mean, I've already mentioned this. This is taken from the Clean Energy for All Europeans package document. It says there that managed well, a fair and just transition can ensure that these benefits are shared by all citizens and all regions of Europe, and that no one is left behind. And SSH has an awful lot of dedicated insights all around justice. So, for instance, they could put it around, you know, the distribution of justice. So, who benefits and who takes on the risks of, for instance, an offshore wind development? Who is affected, but then who's actually responsible? Who's formally recognised as being affected? So it's not just those impacts that people may not be aware of, but who is actually recognised and involved. And that also links to the procedures. So, you know, how can you have formal procedures that inclusively involve all stakeholders, if that's something that even people would want? But it's about sort of questions and process, again, not just bringing people in at the end, but starting to think about them a little bit earlier. And just to note that part of our working group I mentioned around renewables has really discussed this in depth with experts across Europe, and a lot of the research would seem to indicate that sort of overcoming justice concerns by focusing on finance, so getting people to participate financially, often has the perception amongst citizens of almost bribes, whether or not it's intended in that way. And I think it also exacerbates inequalities, because those that are often able to get the money are often those that already have it. So there's bigger justice questions here. If we are really wanting a fair and just transition for all, that it's no harm in asking. Okay, so I'll start to wrap up with my final two recommendations. I think using SSH methods is really important. So it's just sort of a suggestion that I think SSH methods are useful regardless of the topic. So even if everything I've mentioned isn't of interest to you, if you're not particularly interested in these people-related questions, I think SSH methods themselves are really useful. So if you're interested in, real technology-led areas, well, there's SSH-led methods, interviews, workshops, surveys, which can be really useful. They can give you the numbers for the quantitative, they can give you the rich stories from the qualitative side of you, and there's an awful lot of guidance on how to do these well, because there is sort of rigor and robustness which can really help, I think, all involved that are using these methods. So just to say that SSH, from my view, is not just about ideas, but is also about methods. And then finally, I think asking an Energie SSH expert if you're interested in these things, or contact me and I can put you in touch with someone in the SSH world who perhaps even knows it better than I do. I can do that. I mean, I often use the analogy of I wouldn't walk into a science lab and use equipment. I would go to an expert on this area. So, if you're interested in SSH topics, no need to walk into the lab and try and have a play around with equipment. Feel free to contact me or others and help you play with the equipment, so to speak. This was something that we mentioned in an agenda that we submitted to the Commission a couple of years ago. And feel free to look at a database that we put together of over 600 SSH researchers. There's a search open text box in it where you can put in keywords, for instance, offshore wind, and see what comes back. So have a look. It's on the shapeenergy.eu website. And so, yeah, hopefully this has convinced you, or at least made you think around the role of Energie SSH in contributing to offshore wind. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Chris, for a discussion that I'm sure to provoke for a presentation that I'm sure to provoke some discussion here. So, Chris, just to maybe kind of provoke you back to further run on this, I was at a meeting some time ago with a group of mainly engineers, and we discussed the social science element, and basically what they said, yeah, but it's not really our R&D agenda. I mean, the regulatory guys might have some issue, but otherwise not. And secondly, when I said, yeah, but I mean, you see all these challenges. I mean, the obvious one we talked about is social acceptance, but it's so much wider. And then they would say, well, yeah, but that's a local issue to deal with. You deal with it on the side where people discuss that. You have to discuss with the neighbors there. Of course, you have to take them into consideration, but it's a local phenomenon. I'm kind of assuming that you don't agree with that perspective, but I'd like to hear what you say on that.
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, I think they are right in a certain sense that this is sort of like a system level issue. So I wouldn't necessarily always put the responsibility at their doors, because I suppose they're often responding to funder needs, or they're led by profit-led interests for pushing their innovation forward. So I think there is sort of a wider issue around how can we bring stakeholders together, with them being one of stakeholders involved. I mean, as already has been mentioned, the need for regional approaches, multi-uses of sea, global leadership. I mean, it's not just one leader, it's member states, its sectors. So I think there's something there to be said about sort of multi-level and multi-actor governance. But as well as that, I think there is, I mean, although I sort of contradict myself a little bit, saying, think beyond impacts. That's one thing that when speaking to engineers and technologists, they've often been more interested in the impact assessment, or rather the lived experiences of their innovations, to optimize their design, to better manage their expectations, which for themselves can, help manage relationships with their clients, or improve the performance of their tech, or overcome teething issues to do with delivery, like maybe their technology is fantastic, but the installation or those away from their organization that may be delivering it don't quite, doesn't do it to what I think. I mean, these are people everywhere, and I suppose that's what we're interested in. It's people.
Chris, we have a question from the audience, which is, what if the public doesn't like our technology and want to change it?
Wow, that's a great question as well. Well, I mean, I suppose it depends about that's a huge question. I suppose it would depend on the process by which it's happened. Like, for instance, if it was a matter of, my personal view of the innovation being rolled out and then the reaction being they don't like it, versus them being involved in some form of consultation or deliberation at the start, where they're involved in sort of having shared ownership of the choices, then that's different. I suppose the impact of involving citizens more would be different depending upon if you are a policymaker or a different innovator. So obviously I put up the Citizens Assembly output, that graph. That looks great, for instance, for offshore wind, but then, for nuclear or for others, it was, perhaps less good if you were drawing on that evidence. So indeed, these are things that are difficult choices. I suppose it's just a matter of those in power making clear who are the important people making decisions and how citizens are involved. I mean, I know I haven't answered that question directly, but I suppose it depends on the process and how their voices.
It's a fairly big question.
Yeah.
Very good. Chris, thanks a lot. I think time is just about up. Thanks a lot for joining. I really encourage everyone to go in and check the work done by the Energy CETP project. They've got excellent publications. They've done previous work on making tools available. And I think there's no doubt that as we're going to see this massive build out of offshore wind, as we've seen in onshore, we're going to have to face the challenge. The German philosopher Immanuel Kant wrote that because the Earth is a sphere, eventually it will fill up and we will have to face the challenge of hospitality. And I think that goes for wind turbines and humans alike. So on that note, a big warm thanks to Chris. And I might almost say now on to something completely different. No, not quite. So for our next speaker is John Olav Tande. John is a senior scientist at SINTEF, but more importantly in this context, he is our SETWind Lighthouse Initiative ambassador. And for the past year, John has been working with a broad range of stakeholders in order to identify some of the main lighthouse initiatives for European offshore wind research. So John, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mattias, and good afternoon. I'm sure it's quite a crowd out there on the web somewhere. I'm sorry I can't see you, but I imagine you're really enthusiastic and very much looking forward to learn more about what an offshore wind research lighthouse is. And I will try to explain that, and I will also try to explain why we believe this is a good initiative. So my name is Jon Olav Tande, as Mattias introduced, and I'm a chief scientist at SINTEF. So what is a lighthouse initiative? Well, it's an initiative in development, and it is to develop a visionary large-scale offshore wind energy research project, one or more, that will address grand scientific and technical challenges that are crucial for the further advancement of offshore wind energy, providing new knowledge and basis for innovation. So it is basically about establishing some large research projects on offshore wind that we believe are crucial for the further advancement of offshore wind energy to provide new knowledge and basis for innovation. So they will have substantial budgets. So we talk tens of millions of euros, and also substantial duration, 5 years or more maybe. And it shall obviously bring together excellent research teams across relevant disciplines, including, I guess, social science. And thank you for the last very nice presentation. And also sharing a joint goal to advance offshore wind energy and having an ambitious research roadmap on how to achieve this. So this may sound grand, you think, but then you may ask yourself, why on offshore wind? And the reason for that is that we believe that offshore wind has a great potential. And when I say we, it's not just us in the SETWind project, but I believe it's well established. The IEA, the International Energy Agency, they delivered a report last year where they had done quite a detailed assessment of the global potential for offshore wind, and they found that the potential was to deliver 18 times the global electricity demand of 2017. So offshore wind has the potential to deliver 18 times the global electricity demand. Also in the European Union, there are scenarios established by the European Commission on how to reach climate goals and to reach zero emission of CO2 by 2050. Offshore wind is one central solution, and one scenario points at a 450 gigawatt installed offshore wind capacity in Europe by 2050. That will supply roughly 1/3 of the electricity demand in Europe by 2050. And this requires a quite massive development of offshore wind. So it's not just that it has a big potential, but there is also a foreseen development of massive offshore wind capacity. And to do this in a good way, not just in Europe, but also globally, we need to develop more knowledge, and it is really a grand science and engineering challenge. So that's why we are proposing a lighthouse project, one or more on this area. And also it is a reason because we think there is a big opportunity for industrial development. So building offshore wind farms in Europe means also developing an European industry to supply this technology. And this can, of course, be a supply to Europe, but it can also be for export to other parts of the world, and to create new jobs and value basically for European citizens. I also make a note here that 80% of the global offshore wind resource is over deep water. So to utilize the full potential of offshore wind to deliver 18 times the global electricity demand, 80% of this would come from wind over deep water. And deep water in this context means more than 60-meter water depth. And for these kind of water depths, you'd need floating wind technology, which is a quite new technology. So this has to be developed. And the other thing is that if you want to have 450 gigawatt offshore wind in Europe to supply 30% of the electricity demand, then it's not just a matter of producing wind turbines and installing wind turbines offshore. It's also a matter of how to operate these in conjunction with the electricity grid. So Our vision is offshore wind to be a cornerstone of the energy system, meaning that offshore wind shall deliver massive amount of the clean energy that is required in the future, and also that the power system will very much rely on offshore wind to supply the energy when it's needed. So offshore wind must also help supporting the energy system operation. And to reach this vision, we believe there is a need for two lighthouse initiatives, or two lighthouse projects. And the first one is to enable reliable power system operation with large-scale offshore wind. So, how to operate the system with 30% electricity coming from offshore wind. And knowing also that maybe another 30% comes from land-based wind, and maybe the rest comes from solar PV and other renewable energy sources, then you have a total revolutionized energy system, and it needs to be operated in a quite different way than we see today. But this Lighthouse initiative is not to solve all issues related to the power system operation of such a 100% CO2 free energy system, but it is to solve the specific challenges related to large-scale offshore wind. So, for instance, how to bring the electricity from, or the energy from, the offshore wind farms to shore, or how to better operate the offshore wind farms so they can support the electricity grid. I'll come back to more about this. I just want to introduce the other Lighthouse challenge, which is to make floating wind cost competitive. Because if we want to make offshore wind to be a cornerstone of the future energy system, and you know that 80% of the wind resource is on deep sea, you will realize that floating wind needs to be developed. And at present, yes, we can install and operate floating wind farms, and they are operated quite excellently. They deliver very good, but they are presently too expensive. They are not economically cost competitive to bottom fixed wind farms. To make these cost competitive, it is certainly so that by installing more floating wind turbines, the cost of the technology will go down as you develop a supply chain. But you also need new knowledge to be able to operate and design the wind farms better. And you need new innovations to really get the cost down. And I believe that if we do this correctly, floating wind can become economic competitive with bottom fixed and land-based wind in the future. So there is a lot of reports and documents stating what are the research challenges related to these two topics that I mentioned: large-scale offshore wind system integration and how to make floating wind cost competitive. Some of these research challenges are at a high technology readiness level type of research, so it's more about industrial development and demonstration. And this is certainly very important, and I'm very happy to see that European Commission in their Green Deal have exactly grid integration and floating technologies as a topic for their call, which is going to come any moment now. And then, but there is also well established a need to solve more basic scientific challenges. And I think One document that has summarized this in an excellent manner is an article published in Science, addressing the grand challenges in the science of wind energy. And from this article, which was co-authored by really a strong team of academics from the wind energy community, they pinpoint 3 grand challenges. And these are, firstly, to improve the understanding of atmospheric and wind power plant flow physics. And this is important, both related to floating wind and related to operation of the power system with large amounts of offshore wind. Because if you want to operate the power system with large amount of offshore wind, you need to understand the atmospheric and wind power plant flow physics to be able to predict the production from the wind farm and also be able to control the production from the wind farm, which will be essential for the operation of the power system. It's also relevant when you're going to design a floating wind farm that you understand what kind of wind loads and how much will it produce depending on how you design your floating wind farms. This first point is essential for both lighthouse initiatives. The aerodynamics, structural dynamics, and offshore wind hydrodynamics of enlarged wind turbines. That's the second grand scientific challenge. And I'd say this one is particularly interested for the challenge on making floating wind cost competitive. Really to understand this complex interaction between aerodynamics, structural dynamics, and offshore wind hydrodynamics of what can be said the largest man-made machines on Earth. It's really a huge challenge, and it's essential to make cost-competitive floating wind.
John, just a reminder that there's a few minutes left.
Yes, that's fine. Thank you. Then the third one is on system science for integration of wind power plants into the future electricity grid. And I don't think I need to explain that this one is very relevant exactly for the large-scale integration of offshore wind into the power system. So, summing up, the 2 lighthouse initiatives represent great opportunities for new industry, employment, innovation, and also to enable an efficient carbon-free power system. It's a well-established need for more research, innovation, and deployment. I mentioned now the article in Science by addressing the grand challenges of wind energy. There is also the European Energy Research Alliance Research and Innovation Strategy that is in agreement with this. There is the European Academy of Wind Energy report that is in agreement with this, and it is the industry ETIPWind research and innovation strategy that points also to which floating wind and grid integration as 2 main topics of research. And bringing the lighthouse initiatives forward as large visionary research projects addressing low TRL topics to solve the grand scientific and technical challenges will provide a solid foundation for the successful advancement of offshore wind to become a cornerstone of the energy system. Thank you.
Thank you very much, John, for this presentation. We'll come back to the Q&A with you after we've had Michael Hübner's presentation. So I think I will just move straight to the introduction of Michael Hübner. So I think I've worked in Brussels for years, and there are many things that are difficult when you work in European R&D, but certainly the most difficult thing is to have a job of coordinating everyone. And that's essentially the task that Michael and his colleagues in the Clean Energy Transition Partnership have taken on. They're coordinating the R&D community, the industry, the member states, the commissions. They're coordinating it from carbon capture, usage and storage to wind, solar, to bioenergy, virtually everything. So I've been part of the process there for a while, and I really have to say they've done an incredible good job in keeping all the dogs at the right leash. So, Mikael, without further ado, I will leave the virtual floor to you, and then we'll pick up the discussion afterwards. So, all up to you.
Thank you very much, Mattias, for this kind introduction. And yes, indeed, we've taken on a great task in order to bring this all together. My name is Hübner. I'm working for the Austrian Ministry of Climate Action and many things, but also innovation and technology. That's the field where I come from, energy, innovation and technology. And I'm working on the European level mainly with the SETWind Action for system integration topics. And I've engaged myself now in preparing the proposal and at the moment the strategic research innovation agenda for the Clean Energy Transition Partnership, which is one of the co-funded partnerships under discussion in the Horizon Europe program. My experience background that enables me to do this, and also a little bit organizational background, because this organization is helping a lot with creating this new animal, is I'm coordinating a network of more than 30 funding organizations over Europe under the umbrella of what we call the Joint Programming Platform Smart Energy Systems, which is an umbrella of a couple of EERA nets that are dealing with energy systems, smart grids, and system integration. Fortunately, and you have described it as a big task. Fortunately, I'm not alone there. That would not be possible. So it's a core group of countries, meanwhile, that is engaged in developing this clean energy transition partnership. And here you have the most active persons from the Netherlands, from Sweden, from Switzerland, sorry, from Italy, and also Turkey, that are working together here very intensely. And the group is growing, as also the number of countries that are interested and participating actively is growing. I want to talk a little bit now about, okay, what is the idea and the concept of this proposal for this co-funded partnership, and then where are we in the process and what is our vision, how to make this a success. This is a little bit of a complicated picture, but yeah, at least some people have given it a try to provide an overview over the partnerships that are under discussion at the moment. And I don't know if you see my mouse pointer, or if I have a pointer here, but when you see these yellow stars, there's the Clean Energy Transition Partnership here, one of 3 partnerships active in the field of energy, but also, of course, the clean hydrogen is very much related to this. And in another picture, you see here, someone has tried to describe a little bit the major roles of the different partnerships that are proposed under the Horizon Europe program now. And here you see clearly that it is expected that the Clean Energy Transition Partnership will take care about development of the production and enabling technologies for renewable energy on the one hand side, but on the other hand side, also for system integration aspects and energy grids. So what is the main ideas and goals behind the Clean Energy Transition Partnership? We are facing a number of challenges, but one thing is clear: we have no time to lose to make the energy transition possible. Europe's economic sectors require a coordinated and integrated innovation approach to transform our energy system. And at the end, we want to fuel a climate neutral Europe. And what is not included in this sentence, but we want to make, and this is part of European policy, make Europe a technology and solution leader on the global markets in these new energy systems and technologies. The specific objectives of this partnership is we want to coordinate at least 25 national and regional energy-related R&I programs, funding programs. So we are talking about coordinating funding programs in European countries. Our main goal is to bring the money on the table. But of course, we want to do more than just bring the money, but also make it a real program. And I will say a couple of words with the next slides about what does it mean. So 25 is not very ambitious. As I told you, we have already 30 in the existing network on energy system integration. Therefore, I believe very strongly that we will exceed this number of 25, and I hope that we can engage at least the 30 that we have already and go beyond this. We want to increase the transnational funding levels in the priorities that we will select through call budgets with more than 100 million euro per year. And we are quite confident that this is doable, as at least the first indications from countries have been in this range. We want to stimulate R&I private investments. That's what we always want to do with public money going into support of R&I projects. So, of course, there will be a big part for the projects have to come from industry, and therefore it's so important that we coordinate also with the stakeholders in order to get the thing right and to have the right focus areas selected here when we implement the partnership. We want to go not only into research as such, but very much into pilot, demo, and validation of implemented solutions all across Europe. So to increase the impact of research, development, and innovation projects is, I think, one of the important things to achieve to get the energy transition done within the next 10 years. It will become a collaborative platform for research and innovation, where funders and policymakers are organizing this platform and hopefully create a fruitful environment for the stakeholders. It is important that the important work that has been done in the SETPlan, in the SETPlan working groups, in the ETIPs, that this is going to be implemented now step by step. The activities, of course, should support the implementation of the national energy and climate plans. This is a big political driver behind national policies. There is an agreement in Europe, and countries have signed up to implement these NECPs. So there should be a reliable background that we can count on. Therefore, it's important to take this into account. We also want to open the floor to reach out beyond Europe. In some of the existing EERA nets, and also in our joint program platform on smart energy systems, we have started to collaborate with countries outside Europe. In our case, we use the platform Mission Innovation for this, but we also have close connections to some of the IEA TCPs, and also the Clean Energy Ministerial is a possibility to create a link there. And we think that particularly for the idea to make European companies and to make Europe an important player on the international technology markets, it would be very interesting to start using the RDI networks to prepare this, to learn what is needed in other markets, to develop this, to co-develop this with those countries in order to be able to, at the end, be one of their suppliers. And this means, of course, that to build on the work that the existing EERA co-funds, the EERA and the SETPlan implementation working groups, with all the ETIPs, EERA joint programs, and others that are active there, to build on this work seems for us to be very important. We have not to invent something from scratch. We have to build on where we are and boost the development. This is, on the one hand side, a short overview about the country commitments in terms of indicative budgets. And I think, if I remember correctly, yes, these are not the yearly budgets, but these are the 7-year budgets. So divided by 7, these are the yearly budget commitments in medium terms. But of course, this can always deviate year by year according to the policy cycles that we will see in the different countries. Important is that we expect the European Commission to co-fund this initiative with 1/3 of the whole budget provided. That means to double up each and every euro that comes from the national programs. We had a first round of talking about what would be our thematic priorities, and here you can see some aspects that spontaneously came up when countries were bringing their interest to the table. So integrated regional and integrated energy systems, storage solutions, heating and cooling, carbon capture, use and storage, innovative renewable energy technologies, and then of course cross-cutting issues like digital transformation, but also inclusive energy transition, etc., have been mentioned. And with this first picture, we are now at the moment working on the strategic research agenda, where we look much more in depth of this. The governance, I think, very clear, such a huge animal needs a good governance. Why I'm showing this picture here is that I want to stress that we want to look for possibilities to keep a live exchange with the stakeholder groups and the SETPlan implementation working groups and the ETIPs. And we think that this could be done in an advisory group, as you see it here on the picture. Of course, the member states, together with the European Commission, will be in charge to carry this initiative along. The management structure, I don't want to go too much into the detail of this. The important message that I want to give is we have two important elements in the core of it. One is we need to develop a strategic research and innovation agenda in order to build an initiative that is clearly focused and effective. And on the other hand side, we need to structure it a little bit internally, as we have very different programs in Europe. And what you see here in the picture that we call transition initiatives will be initiatives that are thought to gather a couple of European countries behind it that try to push forward a specific challenge in the field of energy innovation. And you see also here that we will not be able to host 20 of these transition initiatives under this umbrella, but maybe something like 5, just to say a number. And therefore, the difficult and important task is to find the main challenges, to find out the main challenges that should be in the center of this initiative. And the idea is that with the strategic research and innovation agenda, we will try, together with all the stakeholder groups in the SETPlan, and this is what is happening at the moment, we want to find out what are the most, or the most important on the one hand side, but on the other hand side also the challenges that fit exactly into this kind of collaboration of member states, because there might be fields where we say this is well covered by the Horizon Europe program. We don't need to bring member states together to particularly work on this. If the big companies, if the technology providers, if the energy companies and the other researchers need it, develop the European projects in the framework program, that's fine, and this will bring this challenge forward. But in other fields, particularly when we think about integrated regional systems or other aspects, there might be a good reason to say here we have a specific USP of a member states collaboration. It's better to bring member states and their money together, also in of course together with the framework program, but also in addition to it, to work on these challenges, because they need the involvement of the member states, of the regions, and therefore it's very good for the governments also that they are involved. So the SRIA will tell us what should be achieved, and the transition initiatives then should hook on one of these identified challenges and bring member states together to develop a yearly work program, a strategic plan, and to put out yearly joint calls for projects. As you see here, we have some ideas how we could streamline this, so it should not be only a loose umbrella that brings different EERA that already are pre-existing under one umbrella, but it really should be a new initiative that creates new synergies. So there should, ideally, to me at least, be one joint call coming out every year, and there should be a harmonized structure so that it is easy for stakeholders to get support from this initiative. Where do we stand in time? In April, we have distributed among the countries and discussed with the European Commission a proposal for such a clean energy transition partnership. In June, this proposal was published together with all the other partnership proposals by the European Commission, and is now up to the discussion from member states which of these partnerships should be further supported, and when, and the timelines, and when this come out with the calls. We have seen already a draft for this partnership in the actual Horizon Europe work program, so we are quite confident that we will be successful. Until mid-September, we are now holding stakeholder group dialogues to develop the strategic research and innovation agenda, as I said before. So we are talking to all the SETWind working groups, which have coordinated all the ETIPs and EERA joint programs and other stakeholder groups. And we are talking to the existing EERA to provide input to this discussion about the strategic research and innovation agenda. There's a number of input papers that are created at the moment from the stakeholder groups, and they will then serve as a basis for the discussion among the interested and confirmed member states that will then at the end formulate the strategic research and innovation agenda. This will happen now in autumn, and we want to present this SRIA at the SETPlan conference in November in Berlin, or in the virtual space, most probably. And we expect that in Q1 2021, Horizon Europe will open a call where we'll then be able to submit a proposal to. The first joint call of the initiative, my personal expectation is that this will be launched in 2022. So there is still some ways to go, but we have the existing initiatives like our joint program platform and other EERA that we can work with until this is really up and operable. About the stakeholder engagement, we have really tried, as I said, and it is really my personal attempt to keep that dialogue with the stakeholder groups in the SETPlan very lively also over the lifetime of this initiative. Now, with the process to develop the strategic research and innovation agenda, we have seen really great contribution from the experts, from the stakeholder groups, and 5 input papers in 5 clusters, 5+9, because we have in renewable technologies, we have a number of sub-papers in the different technologies that have been developed. So it's 5+9 papers that have been developed, and more than 200 experts from these different groups have participated in this process. Matthias, am I running out of time, or?
If you can start wrapping up shortly, that would be nice. That was my subtle way of hinting that at you. Yes.
Yes. So let's do that. How to make it a success? We have to find the right design for the initiative. We want to unleash the potential for collaboration, which means that we intend to build a strong coordination structure that helps the member states and their programs really to contribute here without having too much burden. We have to link and lubricate the elements of the RDI helix with a strong emphasis on the I, so the implementation, to increase the impact of RDI projects and make it become really technologies available and solutions available on the market. We will create an attractive innovation ecosystem and network for the stakeholders, and it's important that we keep a strategic focus where we monitor the outcomes and success just in time in order to steer it and really keep that strategic focus. That was it from my side. Thank you for the possibility to present this initiative to you.
Thank you very much, Michael, for this presentation. I think we now actually have a session where I'd like to bring on both John and Chris for this final Q&A. But maybe to start with, Michael, we have a specific question from the audience, which is that, is the CETP going to support also production technologies, e.g. for PV modules, wind turbines, and develop new means of plant construction and commissioning involving automation and digital solutions? So a specific question there for you. I don't know if you're the right person to answer that.
Yes, the short answer is yes, and the evidence that I have to say this is when we look on the input papers that have been developed by the stakeholders, where we will build the SRIO upon, I think these topics have been clearly mentioned. Of course, what I cannot decide now is what the member states that are interested and finance the different calls in the next years are going to emphasize and concentrate on. But as it is for the strategic research innovation agenda input, I can say that we have received a lot of input about these aspects, and we will bring that up to the discussion to the member countries, and hopefully this will be taken up then in the joint calls.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Maybe just to continue here with you, Michael, on a more overall question. I can't remember about you, but I've been involved in the SETWind community since 2012, and I think for any R&D policy initiative to live for 12 years and still going strong is in itself quite an achievement. Of course, all the relationships have their up and down, but I think we still today have quite a vibrant SETWind community. How do you see the value of this in the work you've done in developing the Clean Energy Transition Partnership?
I think, at least where we are at the moment, with this strategic research and innovation agenda process and the dialogues that we have had, with not existing SETWind initiatives and working groups, it would not have been possible, I think, to bring this all together so quickly. I try really to engage myself in the development of these SETWind working groups, as I strongly believe in the value of it. I was for many years very busy and still related to the national programs in Austria, and I had a big emphasis in my work on developing smart grids and smart grid solutions. And the experience was that it was so difficult to make our own stakeholders and researchers and companies and energy companies aware of what is going on the European level. And we discovered that, okay, if we don't really do active work in linking those worlds, we risk very much that, different countries, different groups develop different solutions in different activities, reinventing the wheel, doing things in parallel. And to be really efficient and effective, we have to coordinate these activities. And to me, the set plan working groups and ETIPs and all the engaged people there are the way to go. Of course, there is always some things that we could do better, but whoever tried to be successful in this field knows also how difficult it is. And therefore, I think the value is very high. And we have to build on this, and we have to improve it to make it even more effective and even more connected and interrelated. That's the most difficult part. Because we have so many interesting outcomes of the different groups, but now we have to bring them also together.
Yes, thank you very much, Mikael. So, on a more general question, one of the issues mentioned by Joachim Balke, who unfortunately had to leave us for another important meeting, was the importance of regional cooperation. I think, Mikael, you're kind of home safe on covering that part of it, on the regional cooperation. But maybe turning first to Chris. Chris, when we talk about social science and humanities, we often talk about the social acceptance as being kind of a local issue. But of course, it appears as local issues all over the place and all over the world. Any reflections from your side on the ambition and the value of regional cooperation on this, maybe reflecting on the experience from the Shift and Shape projects?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, I would perhaps even broaden it further and think that there's multiple scales to it, as in like spaces, so, you know, local, regional, national, international, as well as sort of, I suppose, different boundaries of sectors and expertise, different communities, all of which would, I suppose, have their own way of judging what is acceptable to them or not. And although it's obviously hugely ambitious and, you know, it would be difficult to do, but the ideal way is by designing processes early on to catch what everyone's judgments are rather than waiting till the end. So indeed, thinking about it at regional level is great. Creating something tangible, so around a particular offshore wind development, is often also very useful, because, you know, there's an actual development, there's about some sort of boundary object that sits in beneath all the communities that people can refer to. And also, you know, thinking about acceptance by, say, politicians and you know, elected officials, as well as those at the Commission, that we all have our own judgments about what we expect offshore wind to give us as society. So having a discussion about that early on across all the levels and all the groups, I think, can only be a good thing.
Good, thanks. Sorry, I'm working from home, so my daughter just knocked on the window. So, John, maybe also to you, partly on the regional cooperation, but perhaps a provocative question first. As Mikael said, we're in an awful hurry to solve the challenge we are facing a climate crisis. And here we are talking about ambitious low TRL projects, and people will say that will take an awful long time before they ever make it to the market. So, you know, we're on the same team, but what is our defense against those kind of claims?
Oh, but that's a very good question, and it's a very relevant question, and and I think the answer is quite straightforward. We need low TRL research, and we need high TRL research, and we need demonstration, and we need deployment, and we need everything in a hurry. And it's not so that if we want to go from reaching climate targets, it's not just about putting massive amounts of renewables out there to operate. Well, we could do that, but then it would be too unnecessarily expensive. It could not be very efficient. It may not be socially acceptable. It can have harmful effects on the environment. It could lead to a lot of things that we didn't really want. So it's good to have the basis straight first, but we cannot wait with everything being perfectly researched, finished before we start doing things. So we need to do both in parallel. And I think that's the main message. We need both demonstration, we need innovation, and we need low TRL research.
Thanks. I fortunately see a lot of, well, at least two other heads nodding here, and I assume there'll be some in the audience as well. Another question we often talk about impact. You mentioned it, Mikael. Everyone else mentions it. In my experience, there's a great political interest in funding either kind of the low TRL Nobel Prize research or the closer to market, let's do some impact, cut some ribbons, see some big things going on. Where you might say we might have a challenge in that kind of tedious stuff in the middle where we've done the breakthrough development. We're not quite ready for the market. There's still issues on the business case, but we've got to take the kind of long grind before we get there. Mikael, perhaps a reflection from you on this in relation to the CETP, if I may ask you.
Yeah, if I may take this and also start from what John Olav said, I think, and I strongly believe myself, that RDI, in the sense that we are trying to fund it with our national programs, has to get into a new role. As John described it, we are in this parallel process where we have started already, and we massively are implementing things. But these, of course, raises new questions. At the same time, we have still unsolved questions that we always knew are there, but we have to work on them. And that means this, and that's why what I also meant with keeping the strategic focus of the initiative and keeping always the eye very close on where are we, what is needed now, what is the next, step or gap that we need to fill, where do we have to contribute. This is so important, and we cannot just say, as you said, it's the one or the other. We only need demonstration, or we only need to research, or whatever. Of course, we don't need maybe so much complete new ideas. I mean, we know very well where we want to go, and we want to make that happen. That's the important thing.
Yes. I think that's an excellent quote if we're going to sum this up in a moment, but I'll save that for a little later, Mikael. Chris, you're also nodding on that comment. I guess sometimes you could argue that the social science and humanities have been, some would argue, particularly hard hit by the impact discussion, because at least when we started that in the beginning 5-10 years ago, talking about really the impact, the whole effect of the Swedish Lund conference and Grand Challenge approach, it took a while for the social sciences to be recognized for that kind of impact approach. Any reflections from your side on this?
Certainly, I think you're right, and I think things are changing in a positive direction. I mean, perhaps sort of 10-15 years ago, there was a lot more around knowledge transfer. So sort of the idea that the experts know their stuff, and let's transfer that sort of, in a quite straightforward way to citizens. And then we've sort of slowly been moving towards more ideas of sort of knowledge exchange, where there's sort of, we're learning, the experts are learning from, say, citizens, and citizens are learning from us. And then, in the last perhaps 3 or 4 years, there's been an even more of a push to develop that, I think. I mean, the Commission's ideas of co-creation, which sort of sit at the heart of the missions, of the development of the work programs, so co-creation across the DGs as well as with the stakeholders that are working. It's firmly at the heart of everything they're doing, and I think that's only a good thing. But I think this has come about as a reaction to, for instance, where we started, the knowledge transfer not working and not delivering perhaps the progress through the TRL, or at least the delivering what we want the solutions to do.
Thank you very much. Good. We are kind of closing the approach of wrapping up, but I just want each of you, have the chance to have one wish, and you can address that wish to the industry, you can address it to the European Commission, or you can address it to one of your fellow people here in the group. So if you had one wish to either of those in order to make what you do and the offshore set plan a success, what would that be? It's going to spring it on you here. So anyone who wants to go first? Chris?
My wish, let's be ambitious, is that every single offshore wind project that is funded through Horizon Europe has SSH, some form of people thinking in the concept, like at the start of the proposal, not just at the impact stage. Horizon 2020 had the commitment to mainstream SSH. It didn't quite work out like that, even though they wanted it. They're going to do it again in Horizon Europe. Let's hope it can this time.
Excellent. So first time was a try, next time is going to be a hit, right? Thanks. John, you want to be next on the one wish for Santa Claus?
Yeah, one wish. I'm not sure if I can now do it only one, but I can try to formulate it as one.
We're colleagues in SETWind, so you get to have two.
Yeah. I would very much like there to be. Yeah, I think we have between the four of us a good understanding that there is a need for both demonstration projects and low TRL projects and so on, but really to have politicians and decisions makers to understand that it's not so that the innovation is linear. It is actually more circular. So when you develop a technology or a solution, you also find new questions to dig into, and you're going back to these and do more fundamental research on this will bring up improvements or new innovations. And it's not so that you sort of we don't need anything more of that because now you have already built your first car, so why should you do more research on cars, to make another example. Well, I think it's quite evident, but it seems we still need to tell this story over and over again, and it would be good if it could just be agreed upon.
So that's wish number one. So remember that innovation is not linear; it's circular. Yes.
Yeah.
Good. Mikael, you get to have the last wish. So
yes, innovation. Yeah, is a helix. What my wish. It's not so much related to offshore wind, but to Chris and the social sciences. My wish is that we learn that implementation of the findings of social sciences and knowledge transfer from the social sciences does not mean just to tell people what we know. We need to find the intermediaries that are able to implement this, and to find out who these are. These are designers. These are economic people that can transfer the findings of social science into business models, into surfaces of products that are attractive to people or that guide them in the right direction, how to behave, and so forth. This is my big wish. For the future, that we learn to do this. It's to me, the analogy is very clear. We are not just doing physical science and then we have the scientists and then on the other hand side technology comes out. No, we need the engineers, and so in social science we also need the intermediates that are able to help to implement what we have learned.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Mikael. I think that was one wish from Chris to the funding system, and maybe one wish coming back the other way. So I think we all have something to learn and improve. I think that's a nice start for the next framework program for this decade of research. So thanks to the three of you for being here. I think we can all stay online while I just do a quick wrap up. I think this has been a very stimulating discussion, and it highlights that a lot of important things are coming out. As Joachim Balke from the Commission said in the beginning of the session, we've seen a number of very interesting documents coming out from the Commission, from the Green Deal that came out last year to the new strategies on hydrogen and energy system integration. Next up is the offshore strategy, the European Commission strategy for offshore energy. We have the CETP partnership proposal at the SETWind conference. And from our side in the SETWind project and the implementation working group for offshore wind, we'll have the updated implementation plan coming out also in November and hopefully ready to be presented at the SETWind conference. We'll also keep working on the Lighthouse initiatives. We think that is really crucially important that we remember that. We remember the entire innovation chain. And I think with that, I just want to thank the speakers here and the participants for sticking with us. We have an Indian summer here in Denmark. I'm sitting at home and my small annex is getting increasingly hot, so I had to drop my jacket underway. I don't know how it is for the rest of you, but if you do enjoy the Indian summer, then I hope you have a nice Indian summer day. Stay safe and home from Corona, and I look forward to some point in the new year when we can all get to meet physically. Last but not least, a big thanks to the people from SpotMe. The audience can't see this, but we've had Nadia and Paul working, making things work seamlessly in the background. It's really been a pleasure. And of course, last but not least, to Flaminia, our EERA JPWind and SETP coordinator, who I'm sure will be looking forward to a cold glass of wine on Friday when the EERA conference is over. So thank you, everyone, and that's over for today.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.